conferences, which is going to be the topic of her lecture. I believe she also has a book coming out on the Hague peace conferences and international politics, I believe, by Bloomsbury.
Bloomsbury, yeah.
So without further ado, I give you the floor, Maartje.
Thank you. Kia ora tātou, goeiemorgen, good morning. It is a real great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Tilburg University. I want to thank my esteemed colleague, Professor Randall Seffer, for this invitation. Thank you so much. I also want to thank the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences for sponsoring my visit to the Netherlands as a residential fellow. It allows me to be here for 5 months and to come and speak to you today. I also want to apologize that the last time I was supposed to speak here, I woke up with a terrible migraine and I would not have been approachable that day, so I do apologize for having to delay this talk. Today I'm going to talk to you about my new book project, which thank you for introducing that, which is on the two Hague Peace Conferences of 1899 and 1907, and the one that wasn't held in 1915. But it's really not about the conferences itself, it's really about the public sphere that surrounded those conferences. And I've titled the talk Hagio-graphy, which is a term that Professor Seffer coined not so many years ago as a reference to the ways in which the Hague is mythologized in international legal history, as a sort of starting point of 20th century international legal traditions. And he quite rightly problematizes this and suggests that we are navel gazing if we begin there. There is, as many of you probably know, a much longer history of international law that precedes the Hague, even as legal concepts that have popular appeal preceded the Hague conferences. So in part this research, in fact my whole book is a kind of launches off from this mythology and asks questions of whether it's appropriate, because as you probably all know, the Hague carries a vast amount of cultural and political baggage today. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that circulate on the internet, in the media, about the Hague as a city of peace and justice. And so, for example, in 2014, the associate in law at Columbia Law School, Stephen Eric Goh, wrote this piece, this blog, for the Huffington Post. And in it he explains, for those of you who don't know what the Hague is, that it conjures up a myriad and often mysterious images for people. Some, and this is a quote, some envision international judges in long robes presiding over somber criminal trials. Others recall quaint Dutch streets beset with Vermeer-like skies. He's quite poetic. And then for his eager readers who might be unsure about what the word The Hague actually means, Goh lists the 4 most important features of The Hague. Firstly, he explains that The Hague is a city, not a court. Maybe his American readers need to know that. It's a city that houses the Dutch government, the royal family, and Vermeer's girl with a pearl earring, as well as 500,000 residents. I'm glad we're all on the same page. We know what we mean when we say The Hague. But then it gets very interesting, because The Hague is not just a city. It is the city of international peace and justice, and has been, according to Goh and many others, since the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899. Thirdly, The Hague hosts a plethora of international courts, some focusing on international crimes. And lastly, aside from these courts, The Hague is also home to many other international organizations. So essentially, for Goh, The Hague is a city focused on international legal practices and ideas. Goh is mouthing very much how the city of The Hague itself projects itself into the world. In 2012, it changed its heraldry and it certainly changed its city motto to Vrede en Recht, peace and justice. And I can't imagine, possibly with the exception of Hiroshima, any other city in the world professing such public virtue as a marketing ploy in large, but also as a way of presenting itself in the world. And in so doing, it again invokes the Hague Peace Conferences as the starting point. Sometimes it goes all the way back to Hugo Grotius, but often it begins in 1899. Now, there is, of course, nothing particularly wrong with either of these two depictions. The Hague is not a court, but a city, and it houses a number of very important international courts and organizations. But in so doing, and as Professor Lefebvre has also noted many times, there is a danger of essentializing and of ascribing moral virtue to things that are essential for international relations and international developments. So, in the tradition of international legal history, The Hague is often presented as a point of origin story, as a sort of starting point for a history on ideas in 20th century international law. And there are numerous problems with that. So that was kind of one of the starting points for my book project. So who am I? Well, I am a researcher who's interested in neutrality in international relations, in diplomacy, and increasingly in the relationship between international law and international relations, popular ideas, internationalisms, and so forth, peace concepts. And I have been working for the last 4 years on a book which will come out later this year called The Hague Conferences in International Politics, which, as you've already noted, will be out with Bloomsbury in October. And I've worked on other projects related to this research as well. And the main argument of my book is that The Hague was much more than a concept in international law, was a term with many dimensions and with widespread global appeal from the moment the Russian Tsar Nicholas II called for a conference of disarmament in 1898, which eventually led to the hosting and the holding of the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899. From the moment he issued what is known as the Rescript, the whole idea of that conference, and then the term The Hague came to be attached to the conference because it was actually in the city of The Hague, and the term came to be imbued with layers of meaning, many of which were positivist, many of which were progressivist, many of which was focused on improving international relations, international law, the way in which international affairs were regulated. The term permeated the global press. It had numerous meanings. It was heavily debated. Not everybody was positive. And what I'm trying to suggest today is that in all good mythology, there is always a kernel of truth. And in this hagiography, in this mythology around The Hague today, there is actually more truth than we might consider. The Hague of the hagiography style is firmly grounded in the immense global public appeal of the term and of the ideas attached to the Hague Conferences and to the Hague Conventions in the years leading up to the First World War. The Hague had normative value that meant something to most people who could read. So I can only talk to newspapers, I can only talk then to the people who might have read these newspapers. But The Hague was omnipresent in the newspaper record from the moment the Rescript was issued until well through and probably well after the First World War. So the relevance of my book very much lies in the facts that it kind of explains some of this mythology that continues today. But it also argues against other historiographical traditions that diminish The Hague's importance in their histories. And I'm particularly talking here to the sort of origins of war narratives, and the histories that focus on particular groups of individuals at the time who engaged with The Hague and who were cynical about it. So my book attempts to return The Hague to the context of its time and attempts to do so by looking at it from a global media perspective. And in so doing, it argues that historians have been taken away, or they've been carried away by not only by much of the diplomatic history, most of the diplomats who attended, not all of them, many of them who attended, and certainly many of the governments who were represented at the two Hague peace conferences, were concerned about the impact these events might have on their sovereignty. They didn't really wish to have international laws imposed on the way they behaved, particularly in time of war. They were wary of arbitration, and they presented this as a blight, or as something that was problematic, something they had to be involved with. And so by and large, in the origins of the First World War history, The Hague is either ignored or it is acknowledged as having little relevance, because we get this global war in 1914, and if these conferences had succeeded in what these historians declared was supposedly The Hague's mission, which was to avoid war, to keep war from appearing, then they clearly felt The Hague had no relevance, or very little relevance, in these renderings of the subject. So they quite clearly counter the international legal history narrative, which says this is an important starting point. This helped to determine the nature of international legal developments in the 20th century. This is not to take away from the fact that there are some really excellent diplomatic histories of The Hague that really, Calvin Diarma Davis' work on the United States, Keith Hamilton's on Britain, Jus Dolfer's very good book in German on the general histories of the two Hague conferences from a diplomatic angle. They're very good and they're very useful, but their work hasn't really integrated into the historiography about the meanings of war and peace, or even the origins of the First World War, or even really the general diplomacy of the time. It's sort of separated as something separate from other things going on in the history of these countries and these governments. And some of them reiterate this failure argument, or imply an argument of failure. In the history of peace activism, in which The Hague also features prominently, The Hague is also acknowledged as being extremely important, as a sort of point of origin, as a shift to greater peace activism in the world, and certainly in various countries. They assert, and they're quite right to assert, that it helped to inspire transnational women's movements. It was an inspiration for what we would come to know as NGOs later on. Yet even this historiography too reiterates the claim that while it was important for peace activists, that those peace activists clearly did not have a big impact on the world around them, because we have First World War. So the First World War, something that people at the time could not have known would happen, sort of looms very large in the way in which these histories have been written. They almost anachronistically look backwards. So when it comes to the history of war and peace, as opposed to international legal history in the period leading up to 1914, many historians, but certainly not all, reiterate Mercy Tate's 1942 assertion that The Hague, and I quote here, did not affect the public at large, and, I quote again, met with no general interest or encouragement. And that claim has been repeated time and time again since 1942. So much so that a colleague and friend of mine, Andrew Webster, said, oh, well, I was just using Mercy Tate's claims to hold that he works on disarmament, that disarmament had little value because she shows that there was not much interest or encouragement around the Hague conferences. So what my book tries to do is to complicate and integrate these various perspectives, and to try to show that The Hague mattered and how much it mattered at the time. And I've really shifted my starting point and I focused very much as a starting point on the history of global governance, the work by scholars like Ian Clarke, who works on world society, Madeleine Heron-Oesch and Cornelia Knaab, who argue that The Hague has paradigmatic meaning for thinking globally, and of very famous scholars such as Mark Mazauer, Glenda Sluger, and Daniel Segessa, who also focus on these sorts of ideas and place The Hague in a wider global context. But I was very much inspired by the earlier work of Warren Keel, who makes this beautiful argument that The Hague was both a beginning and an end. It began a new shift in global understandings and global public activism and notions of international responsibility, and it ended an earlier period of those things. What the book also does is speak to the works of scholars like Isabel Hull and William Mulligan, who clearly assert how international legal norms mattered to people in leading up to the First World War and during the First World War. So while I aimed initially to write a general history of the Hague conferences, and I was going to integrate the law with the peace, with the diplomacy, with the military considerations, with the arms limitation, with the actual conventions and the public sphere and urban history, I was also interested in how The Hague has been turned into a site of peace and law. That was all kind of too much, and in the end I decided to focus on this claim about the public, that The Hague did not matter to people at the time, because as soon as I started reading the vast newspaper record that's now available to historians, and this is really where my book was able to do something new, because these previous authors didn't have access to these massive digital newspaper archives. It was by looking up The Hague, or La Haye, or The Hague, whatever, in the various languages, and I'm very lucky that The Hague is a very strange word, so it's easy to find. There's lots of other words you might want to find in these archives that you can search, and then you've got to find different ways of searching, and you can never get a sort of a sense of how much of it is there about that term. With The Hague, that was much easier because it is peculiar. By doing so, I cannot even come close to suggesting that people did not care. In fact, I would like to suggest the exact opposite. The Hague became internationally relevant. It became a norm by which anyone who read a newspaper came to understand the meaning of war. These are big claims. The meaning of war and the ways in which states should behave in time of crisis. It became a way by which warfare and crisis, diplomatic moments of tension, came to be judged and came to be analyzed. It also then became a term in which governments started to use in the ways they presented themselves outwards in their public diplomacy. It shifted the ways they felt they had to engage with the media environment. So while I expected to argue that The Hague was more important than people at the time were aware of, what I'm ending up arguing is that the people were highly alert to this concept and felt it held intense promise for improving the world. And it created a huge amount of debate, and there was a vast amount of critique of The Hague at the same time, because it was understood that it could have, and it did have, widespread relevance. So the reason there was so much cynicism is in part explained by the fact that there was also so much excitement and promise attached to this term. So what I'm trying to show is that these previous historians are not necessarily wrong. It's just that when they focused their lens on their topic, they were asking questions of a particular set of agents or actors or responders, and then they used that to make a more general claim about the larger environment. And what I'm showing, when you look at the larger environment, you see a much more diverse and much more positive version of The Hague. And that picture is extraordinary. For in the period 1899 to 1915, when a non-Dutch person spoke of The Hague, a Dutch person might think about the royal family or Scheveningen or something, and when a non-Dutch person spoke of The Hague, he or she could be referring to one of many things. Firstly, they could be referring to the Tsar and his rescript and the promise and the impact that might have. They could be talking about the rule of international law generally. They could be talking about the regulation of warfare. They could be talking about the rights and duties of neutrals. They could be talking about international arbitration and the working of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They could be talking about the concept and duty of states to mediate conflict. They could be talking about international regulation and global governance. They could be talking about the institutionalization of global agencies in a world city. They could be talking about the principles of arms limitation, disarmament, or controls on weaponry. They could be talking about the peace through law movement. And they could be talking about the two Hague Peace Conference and its conventions. All of those terms were embraced by the words The Hague. Whenever you looked at a newspaper, the context would tell you which meaning, or sometimes many of them, that were attached to that term. And if these contemporaries were inclined to liberal internationalism, so they were looking at ways of improving the world's relationship between states in the world, and or they were attracted to the concept of war avoidance, they might also have associated the term The Hague with a future in which warfare existed as an exceptional circumstance, and a world in which cooperation between states was the norm. So they could be looking at a promise of a world in which diplomacy wasn't decided by a couple of governments, but was decided between sort of almost multilateral negotiations, and warfare could be avoided. Now this is again quite a difference to the ways in which many historians write the origins of World War, not the oranges, the ones you eat, the origins of the First World War, in which they argue that in Europe at least people were militarized, highly alert to danger, and were warmongering. Now that also existed, but it coexisted with this other discourse. They existed at the same time, and that is really very important because it changes the way in which we think about the complexity of international affairs and public's understandings of what was going on in their world at the time. So, whether you read a newspaper in Suriname, in Tlemcen, which is in Algeria, in Delhi, or in the small mining town of Thames in New Zealand, whether you read a newspaper in San Francisco, London, Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg, Brasilia, Tokyo, Shanghai, or Timbuktu, they all engage with The Hague in these ways. Doesn't matter, I checked them. Okay? And they engaged with it as a concept that could have an impact on the way international relations work. Now, they might not have liked it, but they engaged with it in those ways. And they did so in part because of the newspaper revolution of the 1890s, which made newspapers faster, cheaper, more common. By 1900, there was something like 30,000 newspapers around the world. Almost every community had some kind of, that was attached to the global telegraph network, had some kind of newspaper network as well. And other historians have noticed how the Dreyfus Affair, the Fashoda Crisis, the Spanish-American War of 1898, the Samoan Civil War of the 1890s, the Boxer Rebellion, the Boer War were all global media phenomena. Well, The Hague appeared in that same period, and it was also a global media phenomena. But it was in part a phenomenon, because of the perceived stakes involved in The Hague. Everyone cared about issues of war and peace. Everyone cared about the potential of war to spread from Europe elsewhere. Okay, but they also did so because they believed they should or could have an impact on the way their governments behaved internationally. So from the moment the Tsar released his rescript, there was a public activism behind that moment. There were petitions in many countries to governments. There were petitions to the Tsar. There was a huge amount of debate in the media. These all spoke to people wanting to impact, wanting to register to their governments that their voices mattered, that this moment mattered, that this armament should count, that arbitration should be something that governments engaged with. And that, I think, is really quite important, because it does speak to a shift to what we even now know today. With a large number of NGOs, people do think they have a right. It's the democratization of international relations, in part, that we see being acted out here. I'm not suggesting it began in 1898, 1899. It probably did have a prehistory, but it was clearly promoted at this point in time. Okay, so also from the first Hague Peace Conference then on, we see the Hague being utilized to make sense of other moments of international affairs. So it's used as a critique of warfare, often from the Boer War to the Boxer Rebellion, but it is also sometimes used to critique colonial violence, instances of state violence, such as the Herero Rebellion in 1904-5, and it is used as a way to castigate and to judge the behavior of states. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the use of the dum-dum bullet as a way of moralizing international affairs. It was also used as an opportunity. It was considered an opportunity to improve the world, not by everyone, but it helped to heighten internationalist activism, and it helped to heighten a media discourse about what practical steps could be made at an international level to control, regulate, and improve global relations beyond Europe. So this is also an end really of the Congress system determining a diplomacy, a global diplomacy. It's about internationalizing it. It's actually giving small states a greater voice, because they can, they came to The Hague, their voice and their vote counted supposedly as an equal to any others. The Hague also ended up being a model to emulate. So other globally irrelevant ideas or other activist groups used the ways in which activists for peace and law mobilized behind The Hague as a way of trying to create changes on their fronts as well. So it's a reference to the changing landscape of public diplomacy and public agency in terms of international affairs. So what I'm going to talk to you today about and show some not so very nice pictures, so please be wary, is the dum-dum bullet. Now the dum-dum bullet is a bullet with a hollow nose, which when it enters the body explodes and causes immense damage, internal damage. Today it's sometimes a different variant of it is sometimes called the cop killer. It's still used prevalently as a hunting bullet, but it was outlawed at the first Hague Peace Conference as being unconscionable, as being too destructive for use in warfare against humans. Now, dum-dum bullet was invented in 1897 in the outskirts of Kolkata, where the dum-dum arsenal was situated. For those of you with a historical bend will know that it was at the dum-dum arsenal that the 1857 Indian Mutiny began, and so for Indians the word dum-dum had this loaded meaning of colonial repression and violence. It was then that the bullet was called dum-dum was intentional, because it was intended to be used by the British colonial authorities to suppress colonial violence, to suppress protest, to suppress military attacks from what they called hordes of fanatics or hordes of savages. And they needed it, so the authorities claimed, because the normal Lee-Enfield bullet, which was a complete tipped bullet, didn't stop these fanatics from coming. You needed 3 bullets to stop someone coming at you, and the dum-dum exploded, you were down immediately. So it was a more effective weapon for this kind of work. Now, that is meant from the very outset the dum-dum was a controversial weapon. It was a controversial technology, and it was controversial on 2 grounds. Firstly, it was controversial because it was claimed it wounded beyond the norm. It wounded beyond what was necessary to keep a soldier out of combat or combat. because it created such a terrible wound. So medical journals at the time spent a large amount of time talking about the impact of the bullet and how to deal with it, or if we could deal with it, and so forth. But in the media, from the moment it was used and invented, there was this discourse about this is morally problematic. But it was also morally problematic because it seemed to contravene the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration, which banned, and I quote, any projectile of a weight below 400 grams which is either explosive or charged with fulminating or inflammable substances. So the discourse around what was legal, what was allowed to civilized states, and what was expected of a civilized state, and British Empire, supposedly civilized state, what was acceptable, the British seemed to be transgressing those limits. But the British government, in response, said, we need this weapon. This is essential. We need it for our policing. So we don't care what other people say. We're going to keep using it. So the issue was a media issue before the first Hague Peace Conference, which occurred in 1899. But at that conference, there were so many problems in trying to get agreement on issues of arms limitation on other fronts and on disarmament in general, that a number of representatives decided that it would be quite useful to have something on which most of them, barring the British and later the Americans, could agree. So they decided to create a declaration that banned the use of this bullet on the grounds that it exceeded the acceptable limits of military violence. So it was an easy target. It was also true that the British were the only ones who were really going to lose out in using the bullet. Now that's not entirely true, because there is now evidence that the Dutch used these bullets in the Dutch East Indies at the time and after the Hague conferences as well. But the idea was that no other state, big power at least, was going to lose too much by signing up to this regulation. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because at the time the British government mounted a heated defense in support of this bullet and refused to sign the declaration and refused to ratify this part of the Hague Conventions. And therefore, by law, there was no requirement of it to uphold the ban. But despite the fact that there was no requirement for the British colonial authorities to uphold the ban, and despite the fact that at the time, during the conference itself, many British newspapers and the British public in general fully supported their government's defense of this bullet, the moment the conventions came into effect, the moment they were presented to the world, the entire way in which the the British public, but also the public outside, or the media outside Britain, talked about the dum-dums changed. From that moment on, whether Britain had signed the conventions or not no longer mattered. The Hague declared that dum-dums were uncivilized, that dum-dums were barbaric. Therefore, anyone who used any kind of hollow-nosed bullet must also be uncivilized and barbaric. And it is this shift that forced the British government to change the way it used the bullet and the way in which it presented its use to the world. So, and there are a number of examples of this. There's some French cartoons. This is during the Boer War. This is Kruger, the leader of the Transvaal, giving Queen Victoria some dum-dum pills to make her better. She dies soon after that. She was very, very old. And here, this is my favorite. This was another French cartoon where Kruger is punishing Queen Victoria for the use of dum-dums. In French law, this was libelous. You can't depict a reigning sovereign in a demeaning fashion, and so this cartoon was censored, was pulled from sale, and then it was circulated around Europe, including in the Netherlands, for vast amounts of money, because people thought this was A, funny, and B, they really did think it mattered. Okay, so I'm going to focus on a very popular newspaper, the Daily Mail. You'll know it now. It didn't have a very different audience in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I'm going to explain a little bit of how their discourse around the dum-dum changed to show you the impact of the regulation at The Hague. So when it was invented, there were reports about the bullet, both being horrible in terms of the wounds it created and about it being necessary for colonial policing. As soon as during the Hague Conference, when the British government representatives were defending the bullet, the Daily Mail defended it alongside. We need this bullet. Savages need to be stopped. And they're obviously clearly not normal humans. We need stronger weapons to keep them from coming. But as soon as the final Hague conventions were issued to the world, and despite the fact that everyone knew the British had not signed up to them, the Daily Mail started talking about dum-dums as unconscionable, as uncivilized, as barbaric. So when the war broke out a couple of weeks after the end of the first Hague Conference, the Daily Mail said the British can't use dum-dums in this war, in part because they're fighting white soldiers, and white soldiers are not savages, and therefore it would be uncivilized, but also because The Hague declared it. When in 1900 a rumor spread that an uprising in Bengal city in India, the British colonial authorities had used dum-dums, the Daily Mail was very quick to issue a statement that no, it did not, and if it did, it had recalled them already, and now all policing authorities in the city were using the traditional Lee-Enfield bullet. It then added the line, this is a good thing because dum-dums and hollow-nosed bullets are uncivilized and unconscionable. We can't use them. That discourse, uncivilized, unconscionable, anyone who uses a dum-dum is barbaric, continues from this moment on. It permeates almost every war that you can imagine that occurred between 1899 and 1914. And then during the First World War, the Germans utilized, and the French and the British and Russians all utilized the dum-dum theme. The Germans, as you probably know, in invading Belgium and in committing all sorts of other breaches of international law, used the dum-dum as a way to show that the other side, that the Allies, were also barbaric. They didn't say they were more barbaric, they also said they were also breaching international law, and they proved it by putting exploded dum-dum bullets on display in military museums in Berlin to prove to its own public that their war was a just war against a barbaric enemy. So it becomes part of this discourse of civilization. Okay. I'm going to finish with two things. Firstly, I'm going to show how this discourse permeated by showing that even military officers started to utilize or engage with discourses of what was allowed and not allowed in terms of The Hague. So I have a quote here from Major Thompson from the 1st Bengal Lancers, so somebody who took part in the Bengal City uprising suppression, who said that it's difficult to limit the violence of war, and it is very difficult to keep certain weapons from being used. Necessity in wartime knows no bounds, of course. But The Hague and the dum-dum regulations were, and I quote here, a good example of the progressive spirit of humanity, and it was equally desirable, he stated, to prevent the expansion of warfare and the violence of warfare. Now, we all know that the First World War expanded the violence of warfare in phenomenal ways. But that before the war, there is this discourse about whether this should be allowed or not, whether industrial warfare is dangerous or not, is significant, and does and should alter the ways in which we read the discourse around and the use of immense violence during the First World War. And the last example I want to give you is a long quote, but it's a really telling one. This is the African Standard, published in Mombasa, on the 25th of May of 1911. It was reflecting on the Italo-Turkish War. It's when the Italians invaded Tripoli and tried to push the Ottoman authorities out and take Tripoli for its own empire. And in that war, the Italians committed all range of atrocities, but it is in this way that the African standard represents this moment, and it tells you the power of international law, but the power of the Hague, and certainly the power of the dum-dum bullet as an idea in the public sphere. The use of explosive bullets is distinctly forbidden in civilized warfare. Italy comes here, that's to Tripoli, upon a professedly civilizing mission. If for no other reason, therefore, how dare she stultify herself by resorting to such brutal and barbarous methods as this bullet betrays? The Arabs are perfectly aware that the use of such bullets is forbidden. Their only result is to add to the bitter hatred of the invaders, which has been roused in them by the reports of the treatment of women, which of course are a reference to rape, the massacres of men, women and children, which is clearly also outlawed by the Hague and is morally problematic anyway, the wanton destruction of gardens and other property, which is another Hague regulation, and the use of bombs from airships, which is another Hague regulation at the time. You can't throw bombs and explosive things from dirigibles and other aeroplanes, which the Arab places in the same category as the use of the explosive bullets. It's all the Hague. If the Italians could only get out into the country now and poison a few wells, they would have left nothing undone to render a reconciliation impossible between them and the people with whom it is presumably their objective to someday live in amity. Even if the Turks evacuated and handed over Tripoli to the Italians tomorrow, it is difficult to imagine they could ever truly conquer it. Their position is hopeless. What I'm trying to suggest here is that the Hague mattered. It mattered a lot. It mattered to the way people perceived themselves, their worlds, their states, and that needs to be integrated far more fully in the way we understand the period, but it also might help explain a little bit more why the Hague is still represented with such symbology of peace, hope, and justice today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maartje, for your enlightening talk on The Hague. Are there any questions? We have about 20-15 minutes. Any questions? Yeah, Bernard.
Maartje, thanks for your wonderful talk and for all the work you're doing to, let's say, put the spotlight on The Hague and the message that it stood for. You talked about the fact that in the historiography of international relations, The Hague, obviously, at least for part of the historiography, got snowed over by the Great War. To what extent did it also happen among international lawyers in the interbellum or the period after? Isabel Hull seems to suggest that to some extent, while not directly talking about The Hague, but that the whole idea that it might have happened because The Hague was a failure and then international lawyers after World War I took another road, not so much the road of arbitration, but the road of collective security. That seems to be kind of underlying argument. Does that make sense to you?
It does make sense to me. I think it's I haven't done a lot of work on this, but one of my PhD students had worked on the meanings of The Hague during the First World War itself. And one of the things that he found, and I found evidence of this as well, is that it depended on the lawyer. So it's very much how confronted did they feel by the reality of the war and the fact that The Hague was repeatedly transgressed, that these laws that they'd worked so hard on and which they had such hopes attached to it were repeatedly ignored, it seemed. But how they dealt with it, it's only the very rare occasional one that rejects The Hague and focuses on a different way of conceiving of how should we improve international regulations or relations after the war. So they become Wilsonian in that sense. Wilson rejected The Hague as an effective way of regulating international relations, as you no doubt know, because it didn't do enough. It required too much buy-in. It required people to accept that there were rules and that they keep to it. So you needed some kind of police force, some kind of weight, diplomatic or military weight, to make sure states behaved. So you can't just expect them to behave. You can't just, it's not cricket, as the English would say. People do what they're supposed to do because the rules exist and the rules matter. But there is a vast amount of evidence to suggest, firstly, that for the ways in which lawyers and why the public related to the war continued to be through the lens of what was the Hague allowed and what the Hague didn't allow. And even the good offices carried forward by neutral states were claimed as being important. They were claimed as sustaining humanitarian missions, claimed to sustain these pre-war ideas of what matters, of what civilization is. And it's really very much the League for the Enforcement for Peace and all these new organizations that appear during the war years, which are filled with international lawyers, who kind of say we need to build on the Hague rather than we need to replace the Hague. So it's not so much a failure as a suggestion that we didn't do enough, it wasn't enough, we need more. So the Hague does change after World War I drastically and becomes much more focused on the sort of law of war and these courts rather than on all these other ideas that were attached to it. Although, having said that, arbitration continues as a key notion, mediation, the Hague sustaining mediation, neutrality law, all those things have an afterlife after World War I that are all the Hague based. And so I wouldn't go as far as Isabel Hult to say that they all thought it failed. Clearly in the way even the belligerents conducted their warfare and the way they presented what they did, they often did so in terms of the Hague, like the Germans using the dum-dums as an example. They even went to the United States to protest the use of dum-dums to Wilson's government, to say, Wilson, you're a neutral power, you need to uphold these international legal standards, you need to make sure that the British and the French don't use the dum-dum. So these are the sorts of, so that the utilization of the Hague it wasn't just something that was now ignored, it continued, which is so I think it's not black and white, it's a big shade of grey.
Anyone else? If not, then I have a question.
Great.
I was struck by how legal the discourse is in the media present you've looked at, and I was wondering to what extent they also really use positive legal arguments in terms of, for example, with these dum-dum bullets, do they also make claims that it was, for example, now customary law and that it was binding anyway? Or
no, they don't go to the extent of unpicking the different ways in which something is law, but they do use the words of the conventions occasionally, including reflecting back on St. Petersburg, or sometimes they connect it up to Geneva law, and so it's kind of a lame person's version of what is international. It's sort of, there is a law, there's a treaty, everyone's signed up to it, therefore these words matter. So they might engage with the words and what the words mean, but there are a vast amount of, and I was surprised at the number of articles, 10, 15, 20-page articles in sort of weekly overviews or monthly reviews in which a lawyer is explaining to the reader, I'm assuming most of them would have been middle class or a reader generally for those kinds of publications, the implications of each of the Hague Conventions, the implications of each of these things, either for the state or for the world in general or for international law in the future, or for, so depending on which slant they took on the general question. So there is a huge amount of legalese. In fact, they're far better and well read than any kind of newspaper article that we would get today. I would think these are academics writing for the general public, and clearly they must have been read, otherwise these newspapers wouldn't make enough money to warrant their existence. So yeah, but it's permeated the newspaper media to the extent that there's a small mining town's children's newspaper is reflecting on the fact that the Hague Conference is sat and that now there is a law of war. So it's permeating right down to every kind of newspaper, including in China and in South America and Japan and so forth. So.
And in terms of the mythology that exists, particularly in the reception of the Hague conferences, to what extent does that line up with the initial founders and Tobias Asser and his mission and did the reception line up to what the founders predicted, or do you see any discrepancies? Was it the aim, or did it sort of take a life of its own in the reception?
So, in many ways, there was no founder of the Hague, and here's where the mythology plays this big part. They kind of present these men who were delegates at the Hague as if they went with a mission to create this phenomenon. In many ways, those men were exactly what all diplomats are. They were appointed by a state to do a job, to fit a set series of the instructions that their government has given them. Remarkably, some of those representatives were given quite a large open slate on some issues. So arbitration, for example, the British delegates were told, yes, the British government's happy for some kind of arbitration agreement to be, so go forth and make something of it. They didn't go forth to create this Hague tradition. They didn't create, and Assa, we look back and see Assa as being very important, and he was greatly admired at the time for his expertise and his diligence and his hard work and his contributions, but he wasn't considered a founder at the time. So that's where the mythology is really very problematic, because many of the delegates there were well aware that this was a mission that countered much of many of the sovereignty claims and the requirements that say some of the great powers who were there were also trying to advance. So that any regulation at all was achieved was significant, and I would argue that is in part because there was a public expectation that something was achieved, but there was also a vast amount of and that doesn't take anything away from the fact that some things that happened at these conferences were opportunistic. So the Maartens clause, for example, was opportunistic, wasn't planned in advance. It was mobilized in the moment. It was utilized by a key set of individuals like Asser and Maartens himself, who took the opportunity when the debate went in that direction to say, oh, here's an opportunity for us to insert something. And they may have been aware that this would have far greater importance to a tradition of international law going forward than any of the diplomats who weren't legally trained. But many of them were legally trained. So, the setting up of a president wasn't really, it was more actually to prevent other things being included in the law. So, well, at least if we do this, then it's kind of broad language enough, it enables states enough, it doesn't require them to do anything, it just suggests they do things. But in the end, it has had this massive influence on the shaping of the law of war and human rights law and all sorts of things. So yeah, and that's where the problem with the origins and mythologizing. Bertha von Suttner is another one of these people who gets pathologized as having some genuine input in this moment. Now, she was there, she was active, but she didn't shape the content of the Hague Conventions in any way, shape, or form directly, only indirectly as part of a much wider movement of international activists who were at the Hague. And so we kind of tend to focus on these key individuals as having, having this kind of, this person created that, and that's problematic.
Yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, I arrived late, so
that's
I
all right.
if you've mentioned this at the beginning. I was wondering, as today, for example, in international humanitarian law, there are differences of the use and degree of force that you use during interstate wars and during enforcement operation within one state. So I was wondering, what were the debates for the dum-dum bullets? Like, was there any difference if they've been when they're used for example, to suppress the civil unrest in the civil war?
This is a really good question, because the British government went in and thought, okay, so even if there is this declaration, it only applies to civilized states, which means it only applies to state warfare, so it isn't actually about colonial regulation at all. So they didn't worry that much. They had shown that they were against it, they weren't going to sign up to it, they didn't expect to have to hold to the dum-dum declaration when it came to anything they did within empire, including in South Africa during the First Boer War. But, and this is where it gets so interesting, it's not because it was a requirement that they did not use the dum-dum by international law, it was because the public expected them not to use it because it was registered as an unconscionable weapon. You get this shift. And so the state decides not to use the dum-dum. I've got some words that used in 1899, in fact, at the outbreak of the Boer War. The British War Office has this huge internal memorandum documents explaining that in their potential use of the bullet, they must take into account, and I quote, the political and sentimental as well as purely military considerations of the use of the bullet. They're not even talking about the legal, they're talking about the impact of the idea of the dum-dum as it being illegal, unlawful, unconscionable, changing the way in which the state behaves or the military behaves with its weaponry. And that, I think, is it's a really important register. The public does matter, and the public did have an influence on how these states behaved, which we get so overwhelmed by all the bad news about these horrible states doing horrible things, and they really did. And there were people doing horrible things, and there were representatives of these countries doing horrible things. But at the same time, this also existed, and that, I think, needs to be reintegrated into the whole story. Hi.
Fantastic presentation, and it reminded the very beginning reminded me of a work of someone who's currently at the Osler Institute, Sophia Stolk, who's writing a very contemporary kind of sociology of international organizations in The Hague, and draws on like the reviews written on TripAdvisor to try to understand how people experience the open visits of the ICC and the ICJ. So maybe it's interesting for you as well.
Yeah, that would be fascinating.
Yeah, and it connects me to my question, which is, like an international relations specialist would say, you know, this is how international law works. This is kind of an early example of naming and shaming. It doesn't matter that this wasn't legally binding for the UK. The fact that the media could pull up on it and use it, and it was something that the public recognized. It wasn't some panel of experts that no one had ever heard of. And I was wondering, to what extent is this kind of an inevitable or a logical outcome of the new technology, the technology of the telegraph, which is making this kind of daily press briefings of this kind of high politics available to, like you say, you know, the mining town in the backwoods of European countries and other parts throughout the world. That wouldn't have been possible even 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah,
I mean,
or even 10 years
of what
before.
we see even now today with Twitter, kind of a second wave of this, but this just being the first time that you have it entering into local newspapers.
I think you're right. I think in many ways the newspaper revolution of the 1890s presented as some kind of crisis for states, because the ways they normally worked, which was diplomacy secret, it was very much in-house and very much done by certain kinds of men from certain kinds of families, and they all knew each other. That couldn't exist in the same way in an age where everything was commented upon, and those comments came to have real impact on the way governments behave. Not only democratic or semi-democratic states, but all states. And so you see press offices. The Germans are one of the first to mobilize the press office as a way of sending out information they want into the world, but most other governments soon follow. And you also see a kind of a traditional conservative backlash saying, oh, this is nonsense, and we should shut the doors, and we should return to an old age, and we should ignore the people, the rabble-rousers. And so you see a shift in the generations of foreign office staff, the younger generation of bureaucrats are much more familiar with this kind of way of behaving and of saying, well, we need to have a public profile. It's also the age where monarchies become kind of representatives of popular culture. The people embrace, you know, these representatives of the state because they become like them, as opposed to the government and the boring people who make the laws and things. Monarchy becomes popular rather than an agent of state diplomacy, at least in the public eyes. Of course, behind the scenes, there's still all these other things going on. So in many ways, if you're going to ask me the question of how should we integrate The Hague in the origins of First World War narrative, I should say that this, in my opinion, the origins of First World War very much come out of this old-style diplomacy where these few, mostly white, older men make decisions at the highest levels of a high level of government leadership, and that and they make those decisions because they can. They have the power to, but that has reverberations for everyone else who no longer necessarily work like this. And that one of the reasons is this big backlash during the war against allowing, the secret diplomacy, is because of this feeling that they were betrayed, that their voices weren't heard. So, yeah, thanks. That was a great question.
Any final question? Final?
A very short one. Speaking of myths, Grotius was also, Grotius as a harbinger of peace and myth created at The Hague, particularly on the 4th of July, when the American delegation led a laurel on his grave. To what extent is this, and since then of course for many international lawyers, Grotius and the whole Peace Through Law program are much connected. To what extent did that register in the public press?
It was huge. It was the Americans' way of, the American delegation went to, were told by McKinley initially, you go and you do everything to make America look like the home of peace. So Andrew White kind of envisaged this, one of the ways we can do this, a very American way, we'll have a celebration, American celebration, American Independence Day, and we'll, put a wreath, a laurel on the grave of Grotius in Delft, and we'll make this a big event. And it was reported globally as this, the Manchester Guardian typed out his entire 45-minute speech and printed it out so that Manchester, they were liberal readers, so they were probably very interested, could read his entire speech about how Grotius was such an important individual and how this began a new era in international relations and how great the Americans were for connecting the Dutch with the Hague, the Dutch with the Americans to this global vision of, so it really did have, in the United States itself it was really very popular, but it wasn't just in the United States that message came across. Now there was also critique, of course, lots of critique, but if you were to say what is the most dominant message that I read as I was going through all these newspapers, it's this idea that there is something that we can do to change and improve, and these states and the American delegation particularly were very good at the public diplomacy around it, and it helps to explain why there's still these depictions of the progressivist American governments as being these laudatory of peace, justice, law, neutrality, which of course is nonsense given at the same time the Americans are acquiring empire and repressing local populations and native populations in horrible ways. And so it's this, and are asserting power in very imperial ways throughout the American continent as well. But it's a way of presenting one face, and it had a huge impact.
Okay, thank you. Let's all join to thank Maartje once again. Thank you.
Did it work?
We'll find out.
I can still see something, so.